Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, James faces one of the hardest decisions of his life: to stay with Diep and little Nhi, or to obey his father's command and return abroad to manage the family business. What starts as a simple phone call turns into a battle between duty and love, between the weight of expectation and the pull of the heart. When James's father arrives at the farm, the pressure becomes unbearable. But James's final choice will change everything. Stay until the end to see how far love can go when it refuses to be controlled, and how sometimes walking away from power can be the most powerful thing of all. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. Morning sunlight filtered through the bamboo blinds, spilling golden light across the small kitchen. Steam rose gently from the pot of porridge simmering on the stove, blending with the faint sound of Nhi's laughter. Diep leaned on the counter, phone in hand, staring at the dark screen. James still hadn't called. It had been 3 days since his last message, 3 mornings waking up to the same silence. "Mom, look, I made Uncle James a card." Nhi's voice broke her thoughts. The little girl held up a folded paper covered in red crayon hearts and crooked letters spelling, "Come home soon." Diep forced a smile, brushing a stray hair from Nhi's cheek. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Uncle James will love it." But even as she said it, her chest tightened. Would he ever see it? Just then, the phone buzzed. James's name lit up the screen. Relief washed over her, followed by hesitation. She answered quickly, voice trembling slightly. "James, where are you? Nhi misses you." On the other end, James's tone was distant, strained. "Diep, I'm still here, but I can't stay long." Her smile faded. "What do you mean?" There was a pause, long enough to feel the space between continents. "My father called," James finally said, his voice low. "He wants me back. He says if I don't return to manage the overseas division, he'll cut me off completely." Diep's hand went cold around the phone. "You mean he's forcing you to leave again?" "He's not asking," James said bitterly. "He's demanding. He wants me to forget everything here. You, Nhi, the farm, all of it." For a moment, all Diep could hear was the soft boil of porridge and Nhi humming in the next room. Her heart ached as though the air itself had grown heavier. "And what do you want, James?" "I want to stay," he said firmly. "But he's not giving me a choice." The line went quiet. Diep could almost hear him exhale, the weight of guilt in every breath. When the call ended, she stood motionless, phone still in her hand, until the porridge overflowed, hissing on the stove. That night, the house felt unbearably still. Outside, rain began to fall, slow, cold drops tapping against the window. Nhi lay asleep, clutching her paper card against her chest. Diep watched her daughter's peaceful face, tears blurring her vision. She whispered into the quiet, "Please, James, don't let him take you away again." Across town, James sat alone in his car, the dashboard light illuminating his weary face. His father's voice still echoed in his mind, sharp, commanding, unyielding. "You're wasting your potential. That woman, that child, they'll drag you down. You belong in the boardroom, not in some countryside shack." James clenched his fists. "That woman gave me purpose. That child calls me family. I can't abandon them. His father's voice turned colder. Then don't expect a penny of support from me. You'll lose everything. Your position, your inheritance, your name. James had laughed bitterly, more to hide the pain than to defy it. Then I'll build something of my own. But after the call ended, his confidence cracked. Could love alone sustain the life he'd promised Diep and Nhi? He glanced at his phone. Dozens of missed messages from his father's assistant, all marked urgent. Then one from Diep. Dinner's ready if you're near. Nhi keeps waiting at the window. His throat tightened. He started the engine and drove into the rain. By the time he reached Diep's gate, the lights inside were dim. He stood for a moment, staring through the window. Diep sat by the table, sketching out business plans on old notebook paper, plans they were supposed to do together. Her hair was tied messily, glasses slipping down her nose, a half-empty cup of tea beside her hand. James wanted to walk in, to tell her he'd fight anyone for her. But when he saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet resilience of someone who had already prepared herself to be left behind, his heart faltered. He turned away before she could notice him. The next morning, Diep woke to find a note tucked under the door. Diep, I'm sorry. I need time to fix this. Don't lose faith in me. James. Her fingers trembled as she read it. Fix this? She whispered bitterly. Or walk away again. 2 days passed. The sky turned gray, wind scattering dry leaves across the yard. Diep tried to bury herself in work, repairing chicken coops, planting herbs, tending to customers. But the silence from James lingered like a ghost that refused to leave. Nhi noticed too. Mom, when's Uncle James coming back? Diep hesitated. Soon, sweetheart. But you said that last week. The child's voice cracked slightly, eyes glistening. Diep crouched and hugged her tight. He loves us, Nhi. Sometimes grown-ups have to solve big problems first. That night, while Nhi slept, Diep found herself scrolling through old photos. James holding Nhi in the garden, both laughing under the summer sun. She remembered his promise. I'll never leave you again. The next morning, a black car stopped outside the farm. A man in a dark suit stepped out, James's father. Diep's pulse quickened. Sir, what brings you here? Mr. Hui looked around, frowning slightly at the humble surroundings. I came because my son refuses to listen. You must convince him to return. Diep stiffened. You think I can force him to give up his own life? You've already changed it, the old man said sharply. He's neglecting his future. He's built for leadership, not for mud and chickens. Diep's tone stayed calm but firm. And what if that's what makes him happy? Mr. Hui's eyes hardened. Happiness won't pay bills. It won't last. When he realizes what he's lost, you'll both regret it. He handed her a white envelope. Flight details, salary figures, all neatly printed. He flies in 3 days. Don't stand in his way. Diep held the envelope but didn't open it. I'm not the one keeping him here, sir. Maybe you should ask why he wants to stay. The man's gaze softened slightly, just for a moment. He's my only son. Everything I built will die without him. And if you force him, Diep said quietly, everything good inside him will die first. Mr. Hui said nothing more. He turned and left, leaving the faint smell of cologne and the weight of his words behind. Diep stood at the gate long after the car disappeared down the dirt road. That night, James finally called. His voice was hoarse. "Dad came to see you, didn't he?" "Yes. I'm sorry." "James," Diep whispered, "if you go, don't do it for me or for him. Do it for yourself." "I don't want to go," he said, breaking down. "But he's right about one thing. I can't protect you if I have nothing." "You already gave us everything," she replied softly. "We just wanted you here." On the other end, silence stretched long and heavy until the line clicked. Call ended. The morning after James's call, Diep woke up to the sound of distant thunder. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with unshed rain. Nhi was still asleep, her small hand clutching the paper card she had made for James. Diep brushed a gentle kiss on her daughter's forehead and stood by the window, staring at the horizon where the road disappeared into mist. She knew James was leaving today. Her chest tightened as if something invisible was pressing against it. She tried to convince herself that he was only going away temporarily, that this time he would return for good. But deep down, a cold whisper said otherwise. When Nhi woke up, she immediately asked, "Mom, is Uncle James coming today?" Diep forced a smile. "Not today, sweetheart. He's busy with work." The little girl frowned, hugging her stuffed rabbit. "But he promised to take me to the flower market." Diep nodded, her throat tightening. "He'll keep that promise, just not right now." She turned away before the tears could fall. Miles away, James stood at the airport, suitcase by his side. The sound of rolling wheels, airport announcements, and rushing footsteps surrounded him, yet he felt completely alone. He stared at his boarding pass, the words, Flight 07, London, blurring in his vision. His father stood beside him, phone pressed to his ear, giving last-minute instructions to his assistant. "The driver will meet us when we land. You'll attend the board meeting first thing in the morning." James nodded absently, but his mind wasn't there. It was back on the small farm, where laughter mixed with the scent of boiling noodles, where Nhi's drawings covered the walls, where Diep's eyes lit up every time he returned from work. He clenched his fists, jaw tight. "James," his father said, lowering his phone, "I know you're angry, but this is for your own good." "For my good?" James turned to him, voice trembling. "You think success means abandoning the people who make me human?" His father's expression hardened. "Don't be naive. You can't build a future on emotion. I built our empire through sacrifice. You'll thank me later." James's voice rose, raw and desperate. "And what if I don't? What if all your success feels like nothing without them?" For a brief second, Mr. Hui's face softened, but he quickly looked away. "You'll understand someday." James's throat burned with unspoken words. He picked up his suitcase and walked toward the security gate, but every step felt heavier than the last. When the guard asked for his passport, James froze. His fingers wouldn't move. He looked at the plane ticket again, then at the faces of strangers rushing past him, all of them going somewhere they wanted to go. He turned abruptly and walked away. That afternoon, the rain came down hard. Diep was in the garden, covering the seedlings with plastic sheets, when she heard a car pull up. She turned, expecting maybe a delivery truck, but froze. James stood there, drenched to the bone, suitcase abandoned on the ground. His hair clung to his forehead, and his eyes, red, exhausted, searched for hers. "Diep," he said, breathless. "I didn't get on the plane." For a moment, Diep couldn't speak. The rain poured between them, heavy and relentless. "You didn't leave." He shook his head. "I tried. I really did. But every step felt wrong. I can't live a life built on someone else's expectations." He moved closer, raindrops sliding down his face like tears. "I want this. You, Nhi, the farm, even the chickens that wake me up too early." Diep let out a shaky laugh through her tears. "You're soaked, James." "I don't care," he said, voice breaking. "If I lose everything else, I'll build it all again from scratch, as long as it's with you." For the first time in weeks, Diep didn't hold back. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his trembling frame. Rain soaked them both, but it didn't matter. The world could collapse around them, and they wouldn't move. From the porch, Nhi appeared, eyes wide. "Uncle James?" James turned, smiling through the downpour. "Hey, little artist." Nhi squealed, running toward him. He scooped her up, spinning her around despite the mud, her laughter cutting through the storm like sunlight. Diep wiped her tears, her heart finally breathing again. That night, the rain stopped. A faint moonlight slipped through the window as the three of them sat together by the stove. The warmth of the fire replaced the earlier chill. Nhi dozed off between them, her small hand resting on James's arm. Diep looked at him quietly. "What about your father?" James exhaled, staring into the flickering flame. "He'll be furious, but I can't keep living to please him. I'll call him tomorrow. Tell him I'm starting something new here." Diep's brow furrowed. "You mean, I'm going to open the export business we talked about? Farm produce, local crafts, all of it. I'll invest my savings, and we'll register the company together. No more waiting for approval from anyone." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You'd really do that?" "I already made my choice," he said firmly. "If love costs me my fortune, then that's a price I'm willing to pay." Diep's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of relief. She leaned against him, listening to his steady heartbeat. "You've always been stubborn," she whispered. "Guess I finally learned from you." He smiled softly. The next morning, the farm buzzed with life. Sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off wet leaves. Chickens pecked around the yard, and Nhi chased the stray dog she'd named Lucky. James stood beside Diep, sleeves rolled up, helping her plant new vegetable rows. His hands were clumsy compared to hers, but he didn't mind. For once, he felt grounded, connected to something real. Diep handed him a basket of seedlings. "You sure you can handle all this dirt, city boy?" He grinned. "I've handled boardrooms full of sharks. I think I can manage a few turnips." They laughed, the sound easy and unguarded. Then James's phone buzzed again, his father's number flashing on the screen. He hesitated, glancing at Diep. "Answer it," she said gently. He did. "Dad?" There was silence, then a tired sigh. "You didn't board the flight?" "No, sir," James replied evenly. "I'm staying." "You're throwing away everything for them," his father said bitterly. James smiled faintly. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing what matters." A long pause followed. Then unexpectedly, his father's voice softened. "If that's your choice, then make it count." Don't fail." "I won't," James promised quietly. When he hung up, Diep was watching him with a knowing smile. What did he say? James took a deep breath, looking around at the small farm, the garden, the house, the life they'd built piece by piece. He said not to fail, so I won't. That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching fireflies dance above the damp grass. Nhi sat between them, humming softly as the dog curled at her feet. Diep leaned her head on James's shoulder. "You know," she murmured, "you could have had a mansion, a company, luxury cars." He turned to her, smiling. "And miss out on this?" He pointed at Nhi, at the quiet sky, at the warmth of her hand in his. "No deal in the world is worth more than this peace."